On the 11th of November 1965, the white minority government of Southern Rhodesia made a declaration that shocked the international community. In a move without precedent among British colonies, it announced that it was severing ties with the United Kingdom and declaring itself an independent nation. But this was not a movement of national liberation. It was a defiant act by a settler government seeking to preserve white minority rule in the face of decolonization. The move was quickly condemned. Britain deemed it an illegal act, and the United Nations called it a threat to international peace. Across Africa, the response was uniform. Rhodesia's Unilateral Declaration of Independence was an attempt to entrench racial domination at a time when African self-determination was becoming the global norm. To understand Rhodesia's break with Britain, one must first understand the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Established in 1953 by the British government, the Federation united three territories, namely Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. It was a deeply controversial arrangement. Southern Rhodesia, with its white settler elite, dominated the political and economic apparatus. Africans in the northern territories, despite being the majority, had little say in how they were governed. The rationale for the federation was ostensibly economic: pooling resources, integrating transport networks, and creating a single customs area. But many observers noted that its true purpose was to solidify white settler control across the region. In Southern Rhodesia, where nearly 250,000 white settlers governed over 4 million Africans, the Federation extended settler influence northward. From the outset, African nationalists opposed the Federation. In Nyasaland, the Nyasaland African Congress led mass protests, while in Northern Rhodesia, the rise of the United National Independence Party under Kenneth Kaunda signaled growing resistance. By 1960, with African independence movements surging across the continent and international pressure mounting, Britain began reconsidering its support for the Federation. The 1960 Monckton Report acknowledged African opposition and recommended reforms. By 1963, the Federation was dissolved. The consequences were immediate. Nyasaland became independent Malawi in July 1964, and Northern Rhodesia became Zambia in October of the same year, both under African majority rule. But Southern Rhodesia remained governed by white settlers. For many in Rhodesia, especially within the Rhodesian front, this was perceived not as progress, but as a betrayal. To them, Britain's retreat from empire was abandoning loyal white populations in favor of untested African governments. The independence of Zambia and Malawi, led by black nationalists, was not an inspiration, but rather a warning. After the Federation collapsed, the political climate in Southern Rhodesia hardened. In 1962, the Rhodesian Front Party, founded on promises to resist black majority rule, won the general elections in Southern Rhodesia. In 1964, Ian Douglas Smith became Prime Minister. A former Royal Air Force pilot, Smith represented a growing faction of white Rhodesians who believed that the country had to break from Britain to protect its racial hierarchy. Rhodesian leaders argued that they were better prepared for independence than many of the newly decolonized African states. They pointed to stable governance, strong infrastructure, and a productive agricultural economy. In reality, the wealth was concentrated among the white population, while the black majority lived under a segregated and disenfranchised system. When Harold Wilson's Labour government reaffirmed that there would be no independence before majority rule, Rhodesian officials saw this as ideological capitulation. Smith believed Britain was abandoning its kith and kin to satisfy international opinion. His government warned that granting power to African nationalists would lead to violence, economic decline, and communist influence. Rhodesia had already drafted a new constitution by 1965, ensuring white dominance under a complex voting system that weighed votes by education and income. The Declaration of Independence was the final step, and so, on November 11th, in a symbolic gesture tied to Remembrance Day, Smith announced the break with Britain. The British government under Harold Wilson rejected Rhodesia's UDI as illegal and unconstitutional. Legally, Southern Rhodesia was a colony with internal self-government, not sovereignty, and constitutionally, only Westminster could grant full independence. Wilson ruled out the use of force to overthrow Smith's government. Instead, Britain imposed economic sanctions. Rhodesia's sterling balances in London were frozen. British companies were banned from trading, and oil shipments were blocked through Mozambique, though the effectiveness of these sanctions was limited. Wilson's cabinet considered military options, including a blockade of the port of Beira in Portuguese Mozambique, but feared regional escalation. South Africa and Portugal, both governed by white minority or authoritarian regimes, refused to enforce sanctions, and so the diplomatic talks continued. Wilson met Smith aboard the HMS Tiger in 1966 and again aboard the HMS Fearless in 1968. Both talks were futile. Smith remained firm that there would be no timetable for majority rule, while Wilson could not accept independence without it. Across Africa, Rhodesia's UDI was denounced as an extension of colonial oppression. The Organization of African Unity called for armed resistance. Leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia offered political and material support to Rhodesian liberation movements. Zambia, newly independent and landlocked, was most vulnerable. More than 90% of its trade passed through Rhodesia. Kenneth Kaunda's government began constructing the Tazara Railway with Chinese assistance to bypass Rhodesian routes. Tanzania and Mozambique became key bases for guerrilla fighters. Internally, African political organizing was already taking shape. ZAPU under Joshua Nkomo and ZANU led by Ndabaningi Sithole and later Robert Mugabe had begun forming armed wings. The armed struggle was born in exile but increasingly waged within Rhodesia's borders. The Rhodesian Bush War, also known as the Second Chimurenga, escalated throughout the 1970s, eventually forcing Smith to the negotiating table. Rhodesia's UDI was a delay tactic. It postponed majority rule for 15 years but could not stop it. The war that followed claimed tens of thousands of lives. It destabilized the region and entrenched divisions that persisted long after independence. In 1979, after years of war and growing international pressure, including from the United States under the Carter administration, Smith's regime entered negotiations. The Lancaster House Agreement paved the way for elections, and in 1980, Zimbabwe was born, with Robert Mugabe as its first prime minister. The Unilateral Declaration of Independence was the last gasp of an empire in retreat. Unlike most colonial departures, this one came not through a negotiated transfer of power, but through confrontation, bloodshed, and war.